So today I have the honor of welcoming a truly remarkable leader, someone whose life work really is a living legacy and really has shaped how Indigenous education, healing, and governance are understood across this country. So, Dr. Mike DeGagné has served as the president and CEO of Indspire for the last 5 years, a national Indigenous led charity that supports and invests in the education of First Nations, Inuit, and Metis students across Turtle Island. Over the course of his career, he's held transformative leadership roles that span government, healing organizations, and academia. In 2013, he became the first Indigenous president of a Canadian public university at Nipissing University, dedicating his presidency to advancing Indigenous leadership and reconciliation within the post secondary sector. He later went on to serve as the first president of Yukon University, helping shape a new model of education in the North. Before that, his leadership as founding executive director of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation helped address the legacy of Canada's Indian residential school system and advance national healing conversations at a critical time in this country's history. Dr. DeGagné holds a PhD from Michigan State University and master's degrees in administration, law, and public ethics. He has delivered talks in Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand on Indigenous health, reconciliation, governance, and education. He is a member of the Order of Canada, a recipient of the Order of Ontario, and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. He's received the Inspire Award for Public Service and honorary doctorates from several Canadian universities. He served as chair of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences and is currently co-chair of the National Council on Reconciliation. He continues to teach as a professor of sociology at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. But beyond the impressive list of titles, Dr. DeGagné is an Anishinaabe man from Anamage-Wajing 37 First Nation, a leader whose vision has been guided by community, responsibility, and an unwavering belief in the power of education and healing for our people and communities. Mike, it is an honor to speak with you here today and to be able to interview you about some of your legacy and life work.
Thank you very much. That's very nice.
And, as we just heard, it's an impressive list of titles and roles that you have held throughout the years of being an Indigenous man alive on this planet. And, thinking back a little bit, I kind of want to go back just a little. And, how did the land that you grew up on influence the way that you saw and interacted with the world? What are some of those early teachings that you had?
Well, I had two really different experiences, and I think they both made a contribution to I think how I think now. So when I was growing up in northwestern Ontario, my father was a teacher and my mother was a nurse. So two public servants, and that shapes you. That gives you a sense of who you are and what has value. And so we moved quite a bit around northwestern Ontario. In fact, I think I probably moved every year of my life when I lived there, through small towns from Kenora to Fort Francis to
Mm-hmm.
Sioux Lookout and all over. And so that early experience really shapes you. You live in very small communities where it's incredibly important to have each other, and you have to dedicate yourself to the well-being of the community. I think that's sort of the theme that comes from that. My father was an interesting character, as I say, he was a teacher, a high school
Mm-hmm.
teacher, and my mother too. But my father had this idea that um, one of his hobbies was applying for jobs. He was a typing teacher,
Okay.
and so he was really very quick at creating cover letters and
Mm.
resume updates and this sort of thing. And so I think he probably applied for a new job every week. He'd cut out a little ad in the paper and he'd apply for a job. And that's why we moved so often.
Right.
So when I was just getting into high school, he decided he was going to apply for international jobs. And one day he came home and said, I just got a new job. It's in East Africa.
Wow.
So I don't think, no, none of us had been on a plane before.
Mm.
I think my father had been once. We were living in Sudbury, Ontario at the time. And so over the Christmas holidays, to arrive for the 1st of January, we flew through the UK to East Africa and established a new life there
Mm.
for the rest of my high school.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting about that was that this wasn't just a new experience for parents, or it was a new experience for everybody,
Mm.
and it was an entirely different way of looking at the world than we had ever experienced before.
Mm.
So my parents would often stop when they were confronting something that they didn't really understand and say, boy, this is really, I don't know the answer to this. What do
Mm.
you think? And he would ask the rest of the family, and we were,
Mm.
as I say, in high school, or I have 3 younger siblings, and we were all just sort of, well, I think we would do this, or I think we would do that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it was, first of all, such a new experience that everyone was very open to hearing new ideas or to having input.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone was very interested in, uh, listening to what everyone else had to say about whatever situation we found ourselves in. I think it also was a fascinating opportunity to become familiar with what it meant to colonize people.
You're right.
And so we were expatriates in someone else's country.
Mm-hmm.
We were there as Canadians to help um, the Kenyan government establish a teachers' college. And but at the same time, we were bringing our thoughts from Canada and our own experiences to a country. And who
Mm.
knows if we were in sync with what that Kenyans really wanted.
Right.
So it was an interesting way of experiencing being a part of a helpful group of people, but at the same
Mm.
time, having to be very careful not to have a lot of colonial thinking about how things should be done.
Mm-hmm.
And so by the time I got to the University of Toronto, which is where I went for undergrad, I had had both of those experiences. An experience that, a kid in a small town, working or living with 2 public servants, and seeing what Northern Ontario life was all about. And then experiencing this very, very different opportunity to go to another country, watch our parents make a difference in that
Mm-hmm.
society, and then try to understand that society as best we could.
It's really interesting too, kind of like thinking about the ways that the way that your father interacted with all of you and kind of was asking you all these questions. You can really kind of see how it was already beginning to shape you to think about the world and to be sort of like a change maker or to think critically about these new environments that you're in, and then thinking too about, so you're there, you're in Kenya, and then eventually you come back to Canada after
Mm-hmm.
experiencing such a new, different culture, different way of life, total different experiences. Was there any sort of new ideas you had, or the way that you saw the world in Canada and the way things work here after you came back?
Oh, I think what you bring back from those types of experiences, especially Africa, is the collectivist notion of what it means to live together.
Mm.
It's the Western society, even not just North America, but Europe is to an extent um individualistic.
Mm-hmm.
How are you doing? How are you going to get along in the world? How are
Yeah.
you going to be successful? As opposed to, I think, a default in certainly in the Kenyan context of what are we going to do together?
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to get advance? How are we going to prosper?
Mm-hmm.
And so you bring that back, and that gets assimilated, I think, over
Mm-hmm.
time, and you bring that back to a work life, and I was starting university in when I returned in the late 70s, and you internalize that, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
affects your thinking as you move forward for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's more reminiscent too about like I think how our indigenous communities operate, right? Or you'll
Hmm.
see like at least traditionally, right, before sort of colonization and everything happened, it really was how we all work together, how we help each other, how we interact with
Yeah,
one another. So it's interesting you go to some place so far away and they are still embodying sort of those values and those ideas.
yeah, yeah, and yeah, is have I succeeded if none of us, if some of us have not?
Mm,
Right. If I work in an organization and I claim a certain success, if
mm-hmm.
that success can't be claimed by everybody, is it really a success for the
Yep.
organization? And I think if you translate that into social values,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very meaningful principle.
Yeah, and it makes me think about too about the Indigenous students, myself having been one of them, but the students that Inspire funds and how I think it's like I maybe you know the exact number, but something like the research now is showing that I think like 90% of our students go on to work for Indigenous organizations or their communities. So they're taking everything they've learned and they're bringing it back home to community to really kind of bring a focus back on that sort of collective caretaking and
Yeah.
well-being.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think that's what happens. And you also have this overlay of the fact that the Indigenous students are very necessary to the success of our communities.
Yeah.
Um, Many Indigenous students don't have the luxury of just sort of picking and choosing a career for themselves.
Mm.
Many of them go back home to their communities, and people say, "Well, you have to work for us now.
Mhm.
You've got to make your contribution." Especially if they were funded by the community. We sent you
Mm.
away. You availed yourself of education funding. We need your help, right?
Right.
That we have so much that needs doing. So it's a lot of pressure on Indigenous students, both
Mhm.
to enter an academy, to succeed, and then to make your contribution back
Mhm.
home.
Absolutely. And sort of thinking about you now, you're an Indigenous leader kind of across so many different sectors, but specifically education. But at one point, you were one of those Indigenous students that you now champion. And how have your experiences in education throughout the years led you to work in the field of Indigenous education?
Well, it didn't. I don't think it happened right away because when I went to the University of Toronto in Scarborough, where I now teach, some 4 decades later, there were 4,000 students, and now there's 16,000. So it's 4 times the size. I would say of the 4,000 students, there were probably no more than 2 or 3 Indigenous students on the whole campus.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so there was no Indigenous focus or um, emphasis
Mm.
in the late 70s. That just we weren't there yet. We were just trying to find our way into the institution.
Mhm.
Now it's completely different. And for me, my experience was that when I was doing doctoral work in the 90s,
Mm.
um, uh, I was asking Indigenous students why they were successful or why they thought they were successful. There
Mm.
was lots and lots of literature at the time on why we weren't successful
Mm.
and why we were failing at one thing or another. That you could find anywhere, but there
Yeah.
was very little literature on why Indigenous people succeeded
Mm.
in post secondary education. And a lot of those uh, people that I interviewed said the Indigenous Student Center was a really important part of my experience.
Right.
Now, in the early 90s, it wasn't common for every university to have an Indigenous Student Center. A couple of the more
Mhm.
progressive ones did, right?
Right.
From coast to coast, out west and Ontario and out the east. But uh, then in the later 90s, it became the thing to do. Everybody had an Indigenous Student Center, right? So you think about the 100 universities in Canada, I would say that there's not a single one that doesn't have some kind of a really nice place-based opportunity for Indigenous students to get support and network and encouragement and
Mhm.
all those sorts of things. Same thing with colleges. There's some spectacular spaces in this country for
Mm-hmm.
for Indigenous students. But we built the centers first.
Mm.
We didn't spend as much time saying, what would you like to have in a center like
Right.
this as an Indigenous student? What would you
Mm-hmm.
like to see unfold in this place? What is the kind of support that you need?
Mm-hmm.
So we built the centers based on some, relatively rudimentary consultations with students and communities. And then once we had it up, we go, okay, this is a wonderful tool. How are we going to use it?
Mm-hmm.
So I think things have changed in that we went from a time when we really didn't have a lot of resources in higher education to
Yeah.
a time when we got resources, but we still were thinking about what it is we were going to do with them, right? We got
Mm.
a whole box of tools. We
Yeah.
just don't quite know what to do with them yet. And now we're at a point, sort of the third phase, which is to say we're matching up the tools with what
Mm-hmm.
the needs of Indigenous students are. And that's why we're seeing things take off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is so important too. And I think too about my experiences, as an Indigenous student here and going to the University of Alberta, we had one of those centers and we could go in and we can smudge and we would have bannock and soup days. But then when I moved to the States and I did my master's degree at Columbia University, and, I was actually the first ever Indigenous student graduate from my program.
Right.
And that was in 2023, and I'm thinking, how is that
How could
how
that
is
be?
that possible?
Yeah.
How was I the only Indigenous person in my cohort, let alone for however long? So I think too, thinking over of our relatives beyond the border as well, like that, there's a lot of lessons I think that they can take from the work that we're doing in Canada, because it is so much more advanced than down in the States from my experiences as a student over there, for sure.
Yeah, there's not a lot of we're progressing, and I
Mhm.
mean, I have a very good friend who also went to Columbia, and he was telling me the other day, he's a black student, and he said um, we get the sense that many more black students are graduating from universities in the United States. In fact, we're still graduating about the same percentages we always have at the graduate level.
Mhm.
So you think of maybe you see more graduates,
Mm.
but certainly in Canada, Indigenous and Black students are very much in the same category.
Yeah.
We're improving our numbers,
Mhm.
but we have very very few graduate students, relatively speaking. I think we represent
Mm.
in PhDs maybe 1.5% of the academy of
Yeah.
professors, etc. For both Black and Indigenous students, and we've got a
Mhm.
long way to go.
Mhm.
I mean, I think Indigenous people are about 6-7% of the country,
Right.
depending on how you identify Indigenous students.
Mhm.
So we've got a ways to go, because unless we get that tipping point where Black students, Indigenous students can come to the university and see themselves reflected in the academy,
Mhm.
until we get that I think to a point where we're used to seeing Black professors and used to seeing Indigenous
Mhm.
professors, we'll still be struggling. I mean, I think right now in Canada, with 100 universities, there is one Black president.
Mm.
There are probably two Indigenous presidents
Mhm.
out of 100. So we have a long way to go yet.
We have a long way to go. And sort of,
Yeah.
I guess, thinking back to about, your experiences as, a PhD student when you were um at Michigan State. But, you're someone, as what my cooking would say, like you're a lifelong learner, right?
Mhm.
And so kind of going back then to your PhD, how did those experiences there begin to shape your identity as a leader today?
Well, it, it the PhD itself um, shaped what I'm doing now, but the process of going through that PhD really shaped
Mm.
shaped things for me. So I had gone through a program that was quite flexible in terms of how I got to get my master's.
Mm.
And so this new program through Michigan State opened up in Toronto.
Oh,
So
okay.
they came and they rented some space at
Mm.
one of the colleges, and they introduced this program in educational leadership
Mm.
um, through this PhD program. So the courses were done in compressed formats. So you were there for weekends and evenings rather than 2 hours a week for 12 weeks, which is what we're
Mhm.
used to. And it was much more course intensive than dissertation intensive, although we did have to do comps and dissertations, etc.
Mhm.
And uh, gradually, the courses would say, well, okay, we're going to offer this one in Toronto, but the next one's going to be in Michigan. So you would
Mm.
go down to Michigan and you'd sit on the big campus and engage in those sorts of things. And what it taught me was that we have this sense that of what a university is, and it has a certain rigor.
Mhm.
It was set up, the first one, University of Bologna, in the hundreds of years ago, and the idea of a place-based, rigid format for learning. You go 12 weeks and you
Mhm.
take 2 hours a week, and then you take an exam, and then you get a couple of those, and you string those together for 3 or 4 years, and then we'll confer a degree, and holding firm to those formats hasn't really served a lot of lifelong learners, continuing learners, and certainly
Mhm.
hasn't served a lot of Indigenous people
Right.
particularly well.
Mhm.
Why is it that, yes, we're Canadians like everyone else, but we've got this incredible um, isolation that we have to deal with.
Mhm.
And so the notion of you coming to the University of Alberta, you have to come from your community and you have to travel at some distance. You have to be dislocated from your cultural supports and your community supports, and you enter into the culture of the University of Alberta
Mhm.
and you study there. And I think what the Michigan State experience taught me is that you can take that University of Alberta culture and you can
Mhm.
bring it to our communities. So you set up a little class, and
Mhm.
maybe the university provides a facilitator, and
Mhm.
so you have your classes perhaps by video, and then the facilitator has the live interactive part of the course where you can
Mhm.
learn together collectively and network and arrive at answers as a group and this sort of thing.
Mhm.
I think there's a way to re-examine the format of higher education
Mm.
that serves our communities and other marginalized communities a lot better than it
Mhm.
serves now. But we are still at universities locked into this notion that, yeah, that's not the way university's done. That
Mhm.
doesn't sound like it's as rigorous as
Mhm.
the university I attended.
Right.
So I think Michigan State kind of moved me out of a more rigid way of thinking about this is higher education into
Mhm.
something that says higher education can be offered in all sorts of formats,
Yeah.
and it still lets you develop the same thoughts, capacity, and talents and skills as anything else.
Mhm. Yeah, and I kind of want to touch a little bit on there's a few things that you said there that were very compelling for me, but schools as an institution and what that means for Indigenous people, because I think about that often. Like, schools were originally these sites of colonization for
Mm-hmm.
us, and are the root cause of a lot of the disruption in our lineages and sort of how that those cycles of harm are continuing even today. And but then on the flip side of that, you have, like, if I think of reflect on my own experiences as a student, for example, education has been so imperative when it comes to healing some of those traumas and experiences I had as a
Yeah.
young person, which is kind of this catch 22 when we're thinking about what education means to us, what schools mean to us. And I'm thinking about sort of your role then as, the executive director of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And for those that don't know, that's an organization that, is dedicated to addressing the legacy of residential school survivors. And so you having navigated sort of all of these realms and worlds as well, and especially within that role as well, how do you think that healing and education intersect for us Indigenous peoples?
Well, I think it's interesting if I reflect on the Aboriginal Healing Foundation experience, and that was the better part of 15 plus years for me,
Mm.
and an opportunity to work with survivors of the residential school system, and we funded 1,500 community projects.
Wow.
So from one end of Canada to the other, and I think what happened was is that it's really fascinating, and there's a PhD in this for
Mm.
some PhD student somewhere. When you look at the evaluations that those 1,500 community projects did over the course of 15 years,
Mhm.
and what they thought would be really helpful in their healing at the community level, and a lot of it was land based.
Mm.
A lot of it
Yeah.
was let's go back on the land and reconnect with culture. Culture is healing is a
Mm.
really I think fundamental motto for a lot
Mhm.
of those programs. Healing centers, opportunities for us to gather and to celebrate our with people from a similar culture, and
Mhm.
um, uh, relearning language. I mean,
Mm.
our programs weren't supposed to be language programs, but I'll remember very
Yeah.
well we did a very comprehensive 3-year consultation with the people who we were delivering services to, the survivor
Mm.
groups. And the number one thing they said that they would like to see if they could implement some kind of a healing project
Mhm.
was language.
Yeah.
And you think, I don't see the connection, but it's actually profound. Language is
Mhm.
culture, culture is healing,
Mhm.
and all of it is wrapped in education.
Yeah. Language is like the origin of our stories, and oral stories was the way that we passed on knowledge. It was the way that we related to one another, is how we spoke to one another. And so I think when we have seen that loss of language, it's so integral and so much a part of what was lost in the culture and what was lost from the ability for our elders to pass on the knowledge to our children. And even too thinking about, you know, all of our relatives that were in the schools that could no longer speak their languages, and what was lost alongside of that. So when I hear you speak and you talk about language programs, that's the thing that's kind of going to be our inroad to get us back to being reconnected with one another and our culture. It's like, of course,
Yeah.
of
Yep.
course, those things are integrated.
Yeah, they
And
sure are.
kind of too thinking about just your journeys across all these sectors, was there a moment or an experience that sort of ignited and reinforced your commitment to healing and education for our communities?
Well, I don't know if there was like one particular moment. I think a lot of it had to do with a collection of sort of many moments.
Mm.
I think a lot of it had to do with um, how all of those things, whether or not they were the Healing Foundation or the Nipissing University, Yukon University, and
Mm-hmm.
now Inspire. The one thing they all have in common is that they're all governed in much the same way. They're governed by a board,
Mm.
and these boards are critically important to our community
Yeah.
because we operate so many nonprofits,
Mm-hmm.
so many community foundations and community processes and agencies. Even on the national level, we establish, Indigenous institutions, the First Nations Information Governance Center, the National Council on Reconciliation. They're all directed by boards, and those boards
Mm.
are full of Indigenous people.
Yeah.
We've done a good job of recruiting those people, but I don't know that we've done a great job of making sure that all of us collectively, I sit on boards, you probably sit on boards, know how to govern that well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think one of the things that has jumped out at me, if I have to reflect back on, 30, 40 years, is how much more we're reliant on the wisdom of the community as expressed through boards, and
Mm.
how little time we actually spend on teaching our communities about what that governance looks like and what best
Mm-hmm.
practices is.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have, I think we have um, a lot of work to do in that area
Mm.
because it's boards that can make or break an institution. I've been in institutions that have been very successful, probably, in my view, gold standards for how things should operate.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been in institutions that have really struggled. And every single time, the, the it comes back to governance and the board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I kind of want to, shift to inspire a little bit here. I know we kind of talked a bit about that already, and you've shared, all of your wealth of knowledge. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about Nation Builders, which is a project that highlights those who are shaping the future of Indigenous communities in this country as a whole. How do you define what it means to be a nation builder? And how does this concept connect to the kind of legacy that you hope to leave, both personally as well as organizationally as well, as you move on to this next phase of your life?
Well, the good part about working with Indigenous people and Indigenous, services and this sort of this part of the whole social ecosystem
Mm-hmm.
is that we don't have as much depth on the ground in terms of what we've established as the rest of Canada. I'm saying that's a good thing because um, we don't have the kinds of institutions that many Canadians have. We're still there aren't that many Indigenous national organizations and Indigenous provincial organizations, and surprisingly enough, Canadians have lots of those sorts of things, institutions that serve them that are not political. And so the good thing about that is that we can now implement those things and make really significant change. So it's a bit like looking at a whole social network that's just in its infancy, and you
Mm-hmm.
can come in as a change maker and make a tremendous difference.
Yeah.
The way to make that difference, I think, is to identify those people who are making change.
Mm.
And we're lucky at Inspire that we have this 400 plus Indigenous people who we've recognized in their excellence through
Mm-hmm.
the Inspire Awards. We've recognized those people. But now we can't just stop there.
Yeah.
It doesn't end with the presentation of the award. We have to now, and they're eager for this,
Mm-hmm.
press them into service to say, we've recognized you. Here's your award. Now, here's what we need as a nation. We
Mm-hmm.
want you to come back and give us your best advice, your wisdom of
Mm-hmm.
what it is that you've learned in your particular,
Yeah.
walk of life or your portion of the contribution that you make.
Mm-hmm.
We want you to come and talk to us and give us your best advice.
Yes.
And so that's what Nation Builders is. It's an opportunity for us to not let our this tremendous resource of human beings
Mm-hmm.
wander away.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also is a way of honoring a lot of the people who received Indigenous awards.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was really struck a couple of years ago when we celebrated our 40th anniversary of the Inspire Awards, and we celebrated our 400 odd award winners,
Mm-hmm.
and there was as you'll recall, a montage of all of the award winners who have since passed.
Yeah. Very emotional.
And it was really emotional,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very jarring for me in terms of the scope and scale of this. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people who have received it 30 years ago and have passed on, but
Mm.
there are a lot of very young people too that have passed on. And it's so it occurred to a group of us on the leadership team that we should begin to capture these stories. If we're
Mm-hmm.
going to get this wisdom from people, we better get it immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, getting back to this notion of immediacy, that
Yes.
we have needs in our community right now. So the Nation Builders program helps us go back to those Inspire Award winners and say to them, we need you now, and
Mm-hmm.
they're ready to help. And we'd like you to sit down and tell us your story, not
Mm-hmm.
just of your journey, but some of the learnings from that journey.
Yeah.
And we pass those on to young people. So I think it's a very exciting project,
Mm-hmm.
something that's going to take us a few years to do, but it's going to be worth it in the end.
Yeah, and to listening to you speak, it's having those archives is so important when thinking about reciprocity. And if I even think about like our conversation right now, like you're the CEO, you're on your way to this next part of your life and you're moving on, and me, a young storyteller entering in, right? So and the ability for us to sit down and have this conversation is kind of an embodiment of actually what nation builders I think is, right? Like creating those conversations and those moments for our leaders to really connect with our young ones. And it makes me reflect on years ago, I interviewed my Auntie Debbie just because I wanted to hear about her experiences as a young Indigenous woman and hear about her life. And so I asked her if I could record this, and I did, and I kept that just for me. This was even years before I was writing my book or anything. And she ended up passing away from cancer way too young, and the rest of my family didn't know that I had this interview and
Yeah.
this archive. And so I shared it with everyone, and everyone was so emotional about it, to hear her voice again, and to hear her stories. And it was such a blessing. And I think that is the heart of what sort of nation builders
Yeah.
is ensuring that we are capturing those stories as a way so those histories aren't lost, those teachings aren't lost, and we can access those and pass them on to the younger generation. And I think at the heart of Inspire, that's so much of what we care about, right? Is
Yeah.
fostering that young generation, to let them know that their potential is limitless and they have options to pursue what they want. And so, if you could leave one message to that next generation of young Indigenous leaders that are emerging, what would that be?
Wow. I think I would leave the message that um, your work is going to be important. That while we hate to leave you with an additional burden and to put more weight on your shoulders, uh, we as a community cannot afford not to demand this of you. You need to step up. You need to stand up and say, it's not enough that I only have this much education. It's not enough that I've only gone this far with my ambitions and my aspirations. You need to go to the end, and you need to remember that your moving forward is carrying our community.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about you. You need to take your talents as you've been given them, and you need
Mm-hmm.
to apply them. And at the same time, you need to balance it with, look, we're not demanding success of you. We're demanding that you step forward and do your very best, and that you try to do whatever it is that you aspire to do. And don't be driven by what other people want you to do for our community. Do what you think will help our community. We need that. We need a wide variety of people with a wide variety of skills to help us go from, as many people have said, the margins of Canadian society into the center.
Mm-hmm.
That won't happen if we all do the same thing at the same time. We need the
Right.
diversity of thought and talent,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to stand up.
Yep. That was very well said. And pretty much brings us to the ending of the interview here. But I did want to ask you one final question. After speaking with you, you're a man who's been all over the world, and has done a lot of traveling. And I know that with the type of work that you do, you put a lot of heart into it, which means that you bring your heart kind of all over the world, and what that means for place and home. And so I just wanted to ask you, after all the places that you've been, what does home mean to you?
Well, home is a feeling. Um, I I have a friend who I've had him many years, and he went to residential school, and he had a significant illness. It's
Mm-hmm.
like multiple sclerosis, sort of gradually degenerative, and to the point where you arrive at a place and you can no longer move or most of your body, and he passed last summer. But before that, he had been confined to hospital for probably 2.5 years, and before that, he was in a wheelchair, pretty much limited to the small community that he that he lived in. And so I would visit him every 6 weeks. So I would fly out west and drive back into northwestern Ontario. And that's where I grew up. And so I had this sudden occasion over the course of maybe 5 years to regularly drive back to where I was born and grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about the actual physical place. There's something about the trees. There's something about rock cuts. There's something about highways and incredible vistas of lakes from the road, and the kind where you just have to say, I'm just going to pull over and I'm going to have my lunch right here and just sort of just look at the lake, right? That's northwestern Ontario for me, and that's home for me. And I was always surprised that when I did do that, it's almost like your eyes are ready to see this.
Mm-hmm.
Your eyes are accustomed to seeing this. In the way that when you go to some place that you've never been before, that's completely new,
Mm-hmm.
your eyes are unaccustomed to seeing this, and everything seems a little bit maybe surreal or not quite where it's supposed to be. But I'll remember that those years of visits, for the long drives in the car, and looking at just the landscape, and that's what home signified. It's what your eyes are ready to see.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for chatting with me. And I'm very grateful to be across from you and to learn from some of your knowledge. And I hope I can absorb as much as I can as possible to, just like you said, carry that forward in all the different works that I do and that my nieces and nephews will do, and so on and so forth.
Right, right. Thank
So
you.
thank you, Mike.